There is a quiet moment in the first season of Rick and Morty where two characters stand in their own backyard with shovels, looking down at two bodies they have to bury, and the bodies are themselves. The world they are standing in is not the world they were born in. The family they are about to walk back inside and sit down with has no idea anything has changed. That scene is one of the calmest, most casually horrifying things this show has ever done, and almost nobody talks about it as the founding paradox of the entire series. Tonight, we are going through every paradox Rick and Morty has built, ranked from the quieter philosophical ones at the back of the list, all the way up to the ones the show is still trying to outrun. So get comfortable, settle in, turn the lights down low, and if you have not subscribed to Ricker yet, it really does help us keep making these long, quiet ones. We have a lot of ground to cover. At number 35, the paradox the show opens with on purpose and barely flags as one: the Meeseeks paradox. Mr. Meeseeks is introduced in the very first season, in an episode called Meeseeks and Destroy, and his entire reason for existing is to grant a single task and then vanish. Because, as he keeps saying, existence is pain. He is a being designed around the idea that to live for any length of time is a kind of torture. The longer he stays in the world, the more he degrades, until he is screaming, hollow-eyed, and willing to murder a man on a golf course rather than be ignored one more day. The paradox is not the violence. The paradox is the philosophy buried inside the joke. Mr. Meeseeks is functionally an argument that consciousness without purpose is unbearable, and that the only humane thing to do with a thinking creature is to let it complete its task and stop existing. The show then immediately invites you to laugh at that. The laughter is the trick. Because if Meeseeks is right, that being alive past your usefulness is agony, then most of the cast of Rick and Morty should not still be here. Jerry, in particular, has been failing at every task he has been handed for years, and he has not vanished. He has just kept going. Read this way: the Meeseeks episode is not a side story about a magic box. It is the show stating, in its second handful of episodes, a position on existence the rest of the series will spend a decade quietly arguing with. The show will introduce more characters who become more lifelike the longer they live. It will introduce versions of Rick who refuse to die. It will let Beth split into two people who both insist on continuing. Every one of those choices is a vote against the Meeseeks philosophy, and yet the box is still in the garage. The show never reaches in and reassures you that Meeseeks were wrong. It just lets the contradiction sit there. The smartest read is that the Meeseeks paradox is the smallest version of the question the show keeps asking, which is whether anybody on this couch has a reason to still be here, and whether the answer to that question even matters in a multiverse this big. It is also, quietly, the moment the show tells you what kind of show it is going to be. Not a sitcom that has a science fiction element, not a science fiction show with sitcom timing, but something that will keep using cartoon shapes to ask whether life has any business going on as long as it does. The Meeseeks box was a warning. The show is asking you to listen to the warning while laughing at it. That is the paradox at the very edge of the list. At number 34, the paradox of being judged by the Cromulons. In the second season episode, Get Swifty, Earth is one of several planets in what is essentially a televised talent contest run by giant floating heads, and the planet has to produce a hit song or be destroyed. Rick writes a throwaway track. The song advances. The planet is spared. The joke is obviously the bluntness of the satire, but the paradox is sturdier than the joke. The Cromulons present themselves as casual entertainment. They are bored. They flip between planets the way a viewer flips between channels. And the planets they judge are, by their own internal experience, complete worlds. Earth is a place where billions of people have a sense of meaning, of struggle, of history. The Cromulons do not care. They are not evil exactly. They are watching. The paradox the show is laying out, without ever saying it directly, is that any sufficiently distant audience reduces a civilization to a contestant. The longer you sit with the implication, the more uncomfortable it gets. Because the audience watching Rick and Morty is doing a slightly nicer version of the same thing. The Smiths are people on a screen. Their pain is content. The show, in its calmer moments, has flirted with that idea more than once. And Get Swifty is the most childish, candy-colored version of it. It looks like a parody of music competition television. It is, just underneath, a question about whether your reality is anybody else's entertainment and what kind of cosmic fluke is keeping you safe from being canceled. The unanswered piece, the part the show never returns to in any direct way, is who the Cromulons answer to. They are presented as gods of the moment, but they have a format. Somebody, somewhere, is running the format. The show never tells you who. By this framing, Get Swifty is the lowest level of a nested entertainment structure the series will keep digging into for years, all the way up to a literal story train and a man who is canon. The Cromulons are the friendliest version of that idea. They smile, they bob, they love a banger, and they would have destroyed Earth without losing their grins. The paradox is that the show has trained you to find that scenario charming, and then asked you to notice that you find it charming, and then moved on without resolving any of it. It just sits there, in a colorful, bright, almost cheerful episode, and waits. At number 33, The Paradox of the Jerry Daycare. This one is a single throwaway location, but it does more philosophical damage than it looks like it should. In Morty Night Run, the second season episode that opens with Rick dropping Jerry off, we are shown a Jerry Baree, an interdimensional daycare designed to keep Jerrys from various realities safe and entertained, while their Ricks and Mortys go do something more dangerous. The room is full of Jerrys, who all look more or less the same, dressed more or less the same, having more or less the same conversation. They are interchangeable. The paradox, very politely delivered, is that across an infinity of universes, a man like Jerry converges. He becomes a type. He becomes a shape. Other characters in the show are wildly variable across realities. Ricks are different. Mortys are different enough that the show can build a city out of them and still draw out distinct personalities. Beth, the show will eventually confirm, has at least 2 functioning lives in 2 genres. But Jerry, across the multiverse, is a constant. He is the part of the wave that does not move. The implication is that some people are vivid enough to vary, and some are simply who they are, no matter what cosmic conditions they grow up under. That is a brutal claim, and the show makes it for laughs and then keeps making it. Every time we see a Jerry, in any context, he is recognizable inside a sentence. The paradox is that this should not be possible in a model of the multiverse where every variable is supposedly free to drift. If you can copy a man across infinite worlds and he keeps acting like himself, then either the multiverse is not as varied as advertised, or some characters are operating on a deeper attractor than the universe gives them room to escape. The show flirts with both readings without committing to either. The Jerry Baree is just background detail in an action episode about a gas creature. And yet the longer you sit with the room of identical Jerrys, the more it becomes a quiet thesis statement about who, in this universe, is allowed to be a person, and who is just a recurring pattern. The kindest version of the joke is that Jerry is comforting because he stays the same. The cruelest is that the show has decided he cannot be anything else. Either way, the Jerry Baree is the show admitting that not all multiversal variation is created equal, and walking away before you can press it on the point. At number 32, The Paradox of Mr. Nimbus. This one looks like a one-off character bit, and is actually a structural problem the show built on purpose. Mr. Nimbus is introduced in the first episode of Season 5, Mort Dinner Rick Andre, and he is presented as Rick's longtime nemesis, the King of the Ocean. A man Rick has clearly known forever, with whom Rick has an entire emotional history, and whom we have never seen, never heard about, and never had reason to suspect existed. The show drops him in fully formed, surrounded by everybody's instant recognition, as if he had always been there. The paradox is that Rick and Morty, as a series, has built a reputation on continuity. It tracks dead characters, it tracks alternate Beths, it tracks which Rick is which. And then, in the opening minutes of a new season, it tells you that a character who has been allegedly central to Rick's life for years was simply not in the part of the story you were watching. The show is using Mr. Nimbus to say something about canon. It is saying, plainly, that canon is whatever the show decides to surface this week. There is no honest reading of Mr. Nimbus that says he was always there. He was added. The paradox is that the show forces the rest of the cast, and you, to behave as if he was. Even Rick, who is the most reality-aware character in the series, treats Nimbus as obvious. The argument the show is making with this character, very quietly, is that personal histories in this universe are not stable. People can be retroactively important. Relationships can be backdated. Memories can be filled in around a person who was never there before. That sounds like a science fiction premise, and the show eventually leans into that exact idea in later seasons, with memory parasites and brain implants and friend simulations. Mr. Nimbus, viewed in the right light, is the first time the show admits, on screen, that it reserves the right to add a permanent piece of Rick's past whenever it wants. He is the canon paradox in a robe and a trident, and the show plays him for laughs, because the alternative would be to admit, out loud, that the past of this series is not fixed. It is a draft. The show will keep editing. And every time it does, somebody like Nimbus walks in, and everyone in the room knows who he is, except the audience. That is the joke. It is also, if you sit with it, the rule. At number 31, The Tiny Rick Paradox. In the Season 2 episode Big Trouble in Little Sanchez, Rick puts his consciousness into a younger clone body of himself to go undercover at Morty and Summer's high school. The plan goes wrong in the most obvious way possible. The clone body is young, healthy, attractive, popular, and full of dopamine. The old Rick is none of those things. Tiny Rick begins to lose the will to switch back. The show plays this as a horror sequence dressed as a comedy, with messages scrawled in blood under the bed, song lyrics that are secretly cries for help, and a face that keeps slipping into terror between laugh lines. The paradox is not the body swap. The paradox is the choice. Tiny Rick is presented as a version of Rick that, given enough time, would rather not be Rick anymore. Given the option of a fresh start, of a body without decades of grief in it, he begins to take that option. The implication the show is laying down is that Rick's identity, his cleverness, his bitterness, his refusal to die, is not actually a stable trait. It is the cost of being inside the original body. Move the consciousness somewhere younger, and the consciousness softens. Move it somewhere new, and it does not want to come home. That sounds like a small character beat, and it would be in a different show. But in Rick and Morty, it is load-bearing. The series will return to the question of whether Rick is Rick because he chose to be, or because he is trapped that way at least 5 more times across later seasons. Tiny Rick is the first version of the question the show ever asked you to take seriously. The fact that he had to be physically dragged out of the new body and put back into the old one suggests that what we think of as Rick's personality is partly chemistry. The old body produces the old person. The younger one produces somebody we never quite get to meet. Rick himself never comments on Tiny Rick again with any real depth. The episode ends, the joke moves on, and a question gets left on the floor. Was that other Rick still Rick? Was he the part of Rick that does not get to drive? The show implies, gently, that he might have been. And then it goes back to letting the old Rick run things, drinking himself toward the end of another season. The paradox is in the silence. The show showed you a version of him that wanted to keep living and chose not to remember that it did. At number 30, the Pickle Rick Paradox. The episode is called, simply, Pickle Rick, and it sits in the 3rd season as one of the most quoted, parodied, and pulled apart half hours the show has ever made. The premise on its face is absurd. Rick turns himself into a pickle to avoid going to family therapy. The reveal is supposed to be the punchline. The paradox is the lengths the joke is willing to commit to. Rick, as a pickle with no limbs and no obvious means of escape, builds a body out of cockroach and rat parts, fights his way through a Russian compound, kills a small army, escapes a sewer, and arrives at therapy on time. The therapist, voiced with extraordinary calm by Susan Sarandon, watches him drag himself through the door and delivers a monologue so quietly devastating the rest of the season has to absorb the impact for weeks. The paradox is not the pickle. The paradox is what the pickle proves. Rick is a man who can turn himself into anything. He can disassemble his own biology to avoid a single inconvenient conversation. He will engineer a body out of insects rather than sit in a room and be asked how he is feeling. And then, having done all of that, he will arrive at the therapy session anyway, because Beth made him, because some part of him cannot quite say no to her, because for all the multiversal contempt he carries, he is still showing up to a 1-hour appointment with a woman who can see right through him. The paradox sits between those two facts. He can do anything. He still has to be here. He can warp space and matter and biology. He cannot warp the part of him that is somebody's father. The episode does not resolve that tension. It simply lets the therapist say it out loud and lets Rick listen, and lets Rick decide in the very next scene that he is going to ignore everything she said. That is the harder paradox. It is not that a man as powerful as Rick has to attend therapy. It is that even after attending, after hearing himself described accurately by a stranger, he still chooses to be the version of himself who turned into a pickle. The show implies, without spelling it out, that Rick understands his own diagnosis and finds it unimportant. Or worse, finds it accurate and decides to keep being that man anyway. The paradox is that the smartest man in the universe cannot, or will not, change. Every later therapy callback, every season where someone in the family tries to drag him back to a couch with another professional, is the show returning to the same uncashed check. He has heard it. He has filed it. He is still going to do whatever he does next. And the episode where he turned into a pickle is the show telling you, with a flat affect, that he will always prefer the version of his life where he is the most clever person in the building, even when the building is a sewer, even when the building is his own daughter's house. At number 29, the founding paradox of the show, the one I opened the script with. The Cronenberg paradox from the season 1 episode Rick Potion number 9. The setup is a school dance, a love potion gone wrong, a chain reaction across the planet that mutates every human being into a twisted insectoid creature. And Rick's solution is not to fix it. His solution is to find a nearby reality where the same events happened. But in that other reality, a different Rick and Morty solved the problem and then died in a freak accident in the garage shortly after. Our Rick and Morty walk into that reality, bury their own corpses in the backyard, sit down at the dinner table, and continue their lives as if nothing has happened. The Smith family at that table is not their family. The Beth in the kitchen is not their Beth. The Jerry on the couch is not their Jerry. The original family is back in the universe they left, presumably horrified, possibly insectoid, definitely without their Morty. The paradox is the way the show treats this. It is not a special episode. The scene is scored as horror and then immediately dropped. The next week, the family is in a new continuity, and nobody ever mentions the change. The show is making a claim, very early, about what continuity means in a series that takes the multiverse seriously. The claim is that there is no continuity. The Beth you watched last week is, structurally, a different person. The same is true of every other character. The audience is being asked to track a family that is not, in any meaningful sense, the same family. The paradox is not the burial. The paradox is the contract. By accepting a new Beth and a new Jerry without comment, the audience is agreeing the family on screen is interchangeable with any nearby version of itself. And once you have agreed to that, every later death in the series becomes negotiable. A character dies. We could simply go get another one. The show will eventually test that contract many times, with clones, with body swaps, with returns from dimensions we thought we were rid of. The Cronenberg episode is the first time it slips the contract under the door. The reading the show invites, very calmly, is that the family in the garage right now is one in a stack of nearly identical families that have been substituted in and out for years, sometimes without the cast inside the show realizing it. There is a darker reading, which is that Morty in particular has known this since he was very young and has been carrying it ever since. The show occasionally flashes that grief across his face. The paradox is that he can still call them mom and dad. He can still sit at that table. He can still go to school in a town that buried him. By this view, the show is a coping story disguised as a science fiction comedy, and the burial scene is the original wound everything else is dancing around. At number 28, the Total Recall Paradox. This is the second season episode where the family is besieged by alien parasites that can only enter a person's life by inserting themselves as a positive memory. The longer they stay, the more memories they generate, the more crowded the house becomes with cousins and old friends and beloved teachers nobody has ever actually met. The episode resolves with a brutal rule. Real memories include both good and bad. The parasites can only create good ones. The family sits in a circle, names every guest in the house, and any of them associated only with warm feelings gets shot. The paradox is in the rule, not the slaughter. The show is saying with great confidence that anything that produced only joy in your life was a lie. Real love comes with friction. Real family comes with damage. A person who has never once disappointed you, who has never once made you angry, who appears in your memory only as a smile and a kind word, is a parasite. The episode plays this for action. The implication is much heavier. If you take the rule seriously, the show is making a permanent statement about what counts as a real relationship in this house. The Smiths, by the end of the episode, have shot every one of their imagined friends and have only each other left. The people who hurt each other constantly, and the show frames that as the happy ending. The paradox is the family we are watching only believes in itself because of the harm it has done to itself. They are real to each other because they are damaged to each other. Any character introduced later who is too sweet, too pure, too consistently lovely would, by this rule, be suspect. The show occasionally remembers this. Mr. Poopy Butthole, who survives the episode because Beth has actually had complicated feelings about him, becomes the proof of the rule. He stays. The rest die. The deeper paradox is the audience side of the test. A viewer who has only ever loved this show, who has only ever found it warm, who has never had a moment of difficulty with it, would, by the show's own logic, be experiencing a kind of parasite. The show is built to be argued with. It does not trust unbroken affection. It encourages you to hate certain episodes, to be exhausted by certain decisions, to walk out and come back. The Total Recall rule is, very quietly, the show describing its own ideal relationship with the audience. Difficult, ongoing, never entirely sweet. If the relationship was only sweet, by the show's own metric, it would not be real. At number 27, the paradox of the microverse. From the second season episode, The Ricks Must Be Crazy. Rick reveals his car battery is powered by a universe he built, in which an entire civilization spends every day generating electricity for him without realizing they are doing it. The civilization, naturally, has its own scientist, who eventually figures out the system and builds a smaller universe inside that one to free his people from the electricity work. And that smaller universe contains another scientist who has done the same thing again, and so on. The paradox is not the nested universes. The paradox is the moral structure. Each level of universe was constructed by a person who saw themselves as a victim of the level above and a god to the level below. Each one believes their exploitation justified their exploitation. Rick at the top treats the whole thing as a battery. The Zeep level treats their level as a battery. The next level down does the same. The episode is presenting a chain of identical Ricks pretending to be different. The paradox is the chain has no real beginning. The show declines to tell you whether Rick's universe is itself just a battery for some larger Rick. It implies, by structural symmetry, that it has to be. The central finite curve, which the show eventually names in much later seasons, is a partial answer, but only a partial one. The microverse paradox is the show insisting scale does not change ethics. A tiny civilization that suffers is still a civilization. A tiny scientist who comes up with the same monstrous solution his god came up with is still a monster. And the show, with no scolding tone, just lets the chain extend, lets the scientists keep building their batteries, and lets Rick drive away. The implication is the universe Rick lives in is a battery for somebody. There is no honest reading of the episode that does not arrive at that. The show has refused to confirm it on screen, but every later episode in which Rick complains about being trapped in a story, or being written, or being run by an unseen narrator, is borrowing from the microverse logic. The paradox is recursive. The show keeps trying to wake up from a structure it knows it is inside, and the structure keeps absorbing the attempt as part of itself. The Zeep level is real. The level below Zeep is real. The level Rick lives in is real, by the same standard. And somewhere, a larger Rick is using whatever the Smiths are doing to charge his car. And the show wants you to notice you cannot prove otherwise. At number 26, the Operation Phoenix Paradox. In the Season 2 finale, The Wedding Squanchers, when Bird Person is killed at his own wedding, the show plays the death as a real and grieving loss. Bird Person was Rick's oldest friend. He was a calm, knowing presence in some of the warmest scenes the early show ever produced. He is buried. The episode mourns him. Later seasons, by various means, reveal that Rick has been running a clone program of his own called Operation Phoenix, which he uses to keep bodies, including his own, on standby. Bird Person himself eventually returns to the show, by a different mechanism than the Operation Phoenix backup. But the existence of that program changes how you read every death you have already watched. The paradox is the inconsistency. By most accounts, nothing the show has ever portrayed as a permanent death actually had to be. Rick has had the technological capability all along. Many characters Rick has lost across the run of the series could, in principle, have been brought back in some form. The show has chosen not to. The implication, which the show never quite says out loud, is that Rick allows people to stay dead. He keeps a portion of the dead in storage, in one form or another, and revives them only when it suits a plotline he is willing to engage with. The paradox is not technological, it is emotional. Rick can fix this. He chooses not to, most of the time. The bodies in tanks are not a sign of generosity. They are a sign of selection. Who Rick keeps and who he lets stay buried is, by his own admission, a personal calculus. The show implies this is one of the cruelest things about him, and one of the kindest. He could keep his oldest friend asleep forever in a vat and never have to face him again. He chooses, in one specific story arc, to bring him back. He has not chosen to recover other people. The paradox is, the grief in the show was always conditional. Every funeral has an asterisk. Every cremation is technically reversible. And the show, by introducing Operation Phoenix and then walking away from it, is asking you to recalibrate every previous death you watched. None of them were final. They were chosen. The decision to grieve a Rick and Morty character is, from this point forward, partly a decision to trust the writers, or Rick himself, will not undo the death later for convenience. The show is asking you to grieve in a universe where grief is a setting. The paradox is that you still do. At number 25, the Whirly-Durly Paradox. The Whirly-Durly Conspiracy is the third season episode where Rick and Jerry go on a resort vacation together, and the paradox is delivered very quietly, almost as a throwaway. Jerry is told the resort is built with a kind of force field that makes its guests immortal while inside it. Inside, nothing can hurt you. The implication is supposed to be calming. Within the bubble, you are safe. The actual implication, which the show lets land slowly, is much heavier. If you can build a place that suspends mortality, then mortality is a setting. It is a thing that can be turned off, which means that everywhere mortality is on, it is on by choice. The resort exists. Therefore, the rest of the universe is a deliberately dangerous version of the universe. Rick clearly knows about the resort. he has presumably visited. He has chosen almost every other day of his life to be in a place where he can die. The paradox is what that choice says about him. He claims to fear nothing. He claims to want nothing. He treats his own death as an inconvenience. And yet, a destination exists where his death would simply not be possible, and he is not there. He is in his daughter's garage. He is on Earth. He is wherever the story is. The implication, never spoken, is Rick prefers the version of himself that is killable. He prefers the universe in which his choices can finally cost him. The bubble is a comfort, and Rick refuses comfort. The Jerry side of the episode is the joke. Jerry is amazed, nothing can hurt him, and behaves like a small child, and the show plays the contrast for warmth. But the more important read is on the Rick side. Rick is being shown a place where he could simply stop being mortal. He does not stay. He leaves. The paradox is the show has handed him an exit, and he refuses to take it. And the show does not explain why. The most honest reading is that Rick wants to be punishable. He wants the universe to be capable of taking him out. The bubble would mean he is finally beyond consequence. And consequence, even for a man like him, turns out to be the only structure he respects. The whirly-dirly paradox is the show admitting Rick stays mortal on purpose, and that his refusal to live in a safe place is the closest thing he has to a moral position. It is, very quietly, a clue about the man we have been watching. He could leave. He stays. There is no good reason for that, except he wants to be where there are stakes. At number 24, the toxic Rick paradox. In the Season 3 episode, Rest and Ricklaxation, Rick and Morty use a device that separates each of them into their toxic and healthy halves. The toxic halves are discarded. The healthy halves go about their lives, calm and present and emotionally available. The toxic halves, locked together in a poisonous waste dimension, begin to scheme and rebuild and eventually claw their way back out. The paradox is the assignment. The device, by Rick's own design, knows which parts of him are toxic and which are not. The toxic Rick is hateful, cruel, paranoid, addictive, contemptuous of everybody around him. The healthy Rick is kind, present, capable of love, and absolutely terrifying to the toxic Rick. The episode ends with the toxic halves reattached, against the will of the healthy halves, because the healthy halves cannot defend themselves. The show is making a precise claim. The version of Rick we have been watching this entire time is closer to the toxic Rick than the healthy one. He is not a man with a small toxic component. He is a man whose toxicity is the dominant settler. The healthy Rick is a brief tourist. The paradox is that the show, having shown you both versions, calmly puts the wrong one back in charge, or what it calls the wrong one. The deeper question is whether the toxic Rick is actually wrong about anything. He sees the multiverse as cruel. He treats sentiment as a vulnerability. He treats Morty as a tool. In the universe Rick lives in, all three readings are arguably correct. The healthy Rick was not happier because he was right. He was happier because he was missing the data the toxic Rick had. The paradox the show leaves you with is that Rick may not be a sick man so much as an accurate man, and that the parts of him that look like wellness are the parts of him that have stopped looking. The episode never directly endorses that read. It just lets the toxic Rick win and walks away. By this view, every later season is the show watching the toxic version of its lead, knowing what the healthy version would have been, and refusing to lie about which one this is. At number 23, the multiplicity paradox. In the Season 5 episode Multiplicity, the family gets attacked, killed, and replaced by decoy versions of themselves so many times, the episode loses count of which family is the original. The Smiths have been hiring decoy companies to send out fake versions of themselves to absorb assassination attempts, except the decoys, not realizing they are decoys, hire decoys, and those decoys hire decoys, until the planet is full of fake Smith families being killed by other fake Smith families in a kind of rolling cellular suicide. The paradox is that, by the end of the episode, the family that is alive on screen has no way to confirm whether they are the original. The show is not coy about this. It tells you, in voiceover and in dialogue, that the survivors might be a decoy. The credits roll on a family eating dinner and not knowing whether their dinner is the real one. The paradox is the audience side again. The show has trained you to track which family is the family, and then announce that the family on screen might not be. It does not matter, on a story level, whether they are. They live the same life. They eat the same dinner. They will be in next week's episode. The implication is the worst version of the multiversal contract. Not only can the original family be killed and replaced, they can be killed and replaced indefinitely by versions of themselves who do not know they are replacements. And the show will keep going as if nothing has happened. The reading is that this has been the actual ongoing condition of the show for years. and the Cronenberg episode was the polite version. Multiplicity is the show finally admitting there is no identifiable real family. There are families, plural, who all think they are the real one, and the camera follows whichever one survived the morning. The paradox is bottomless. There is no test the family can run to verify themselves. The show explicitly closes off every test you can think of. Memory does not help, because decoys have memories. Pain does not help, because decoys feel pain. Even self-awareness does not help, because the most recent decoy generation became convinced they were the original. The episode is the show staring at the bottom of its own concept and shrugging. The family on screen now is a family. Whether they are the family is a question without an answer. The show keeps going. At number 22, The Beth Paradox. In the Season 3 episode, The ABCs of Beth, Rick offers Beth a clone procedure. He will copy her perfectly, put the copy in her life so her husband and children never know she has gone, and let the original Beth leave to explore the universe. By the end of the episode, you watch Beth make a decision, and then the show pointedly does not tell you which Beth left and which Beth stayed. The cut is deliberate. The next several seasons proceed with a Beth at home and a Beth in space, and the show very specifically refuses to confirm which one is the original. They are equally Beth. They both have her memories, they both have her face, they both have her relationship with Rick. The paradox is structural. By the show's own internal logic, a perfect clone is not distinguishable from the original. Both Beths are real. Both Beths are Beth. The show eventually leans into this in the Season 6 episode Bethic Twinstinct, where both Beths exist in the same room and begin a relationship with each other, which the show plays as a deeply strange but earnest exploration of what it means for a person to be in two places. The paradox is not about identity, exactly. It is about parents. The Beth that stays is the Beth the kids think is their mother. The Beth that leaves is, by every measurable standard, equally their mother. The Beth that leaves missed every single moment the Beth that stayed witnessed. They are no longer the same person, even if they were once a perfect copy of each other. The paradox the show is dramatizing is that a person is, in part, the days they actually had. Take two identical people, give them different weeks, and they diverge. Take two Beths, give them years apart, and you have two daughters of Rick, both real, both grieving slightly different things. The show, after a few seasons, treats them as separate. The paradox is whether they were ever one. The show implies, gently, that the question is no longer well-formed. Whichever Beth was the original at the moment of the cloning. After that, the question stopped meaning anything. They were both her. They both still are. By this view, the show is using Beth to illustrate a piece of its philosophy that it cannot say out loud, which is that personal identity is not a continuous line. It is a position you happen to be in at a given moment, and any later position is a different person wearing the same memories. At number 21, The Phoenix Person Paradox. After Bird Person dies, in the Season 3 premiere The Rick Shank Redemption, the Galactic Federation revives him as a cyborg called Phoenix Person, fitted with weapons controlled by their programming, with no memory of who he was. The paradox is what the show then does with this character. Phoenix Person is not Bird Person. He attacks Rick. He is loyal to a government Bird Person hated. He is, in every functional sense, a different consciousness in a familiar body. And then, much later, in the Season 5 episode, Rick Turnal Friendshine of the Spotless Mort, Rick goes inside Bird Person's mind to retrieve the original. The episode treats it as a rescue. The implication is that the original Bird Person was still in there. He had been buried under the cyborg programming, hidden in a part of the mind even Phoenix Person could not reach. Waiting, the paradox is that this is, by the show's own earlier rules, impossible. A consciousness that has been dead, rebuilt, reprogrammed, and given a different identity is, by every test the show has previously applied, a different person in the same shell. The Cronenberg burial said so. The Beth clone storyline said so. The multiplicity decoy said so. And yet Rick, in this one specific case, is allowed to find the original soul of his oldest friend intact in the basement of a stolen body. The show does not justify the exception. It just allows it. The paradox is that the show, which is willing to be ruthlessly consistent about identity for jokes and for tragedy, makes an exception for love. Rick wanted Bird Person back. The show let him have Bird Person back. The Phoenix Person Paradox is the show admitting it will bend its own rules for the right grief. The deeper question, the one the show carefully does not answer, is whether the Bird Person who comes back is actually the original, or whether Rick chose to believe he was. Inside the mindscape, the show stages a series of memories and confrontations that look like a man rebuilding himself. From outside, you cannot prove the rebuilding was reconstruction rather than fabrication. Rick assembled the parts. Rick decided what was bird person. By the show's own logic, that is suspicious. The paradox is that the show invites the suspicion and then refuses to confirm it. Bird person is back. The show and Rick decline to interrogate whether the bird person who is back is the same one they buried. They simply welcome him. The show implies this is what grief actually requires, that the line between memory and resurrection is not as firm as it sounds, and that the people we let back into our lives after we have lost them are partly people we have reassembled in our own minds anyway. Phoenix person is, by this reading, the most honest thing the show has ever said about grief. We bring back the people we miss. We tell ourselves they are the same. We are partly right. At number 20, the Death Crystal Paradox. In the Season 4 premiere, Edge of Morty Rick Die Rick Pete, Morty acquires a crystal that lets him see all possible deaths from his current position and lets him steer toward the one he likes best. He focuses on a death in which he dies of old age in bed with a girl from his school named Jessica at his side. The longer he holds the crystal, the more aggressively he edits his own present to push reality toward that ending. The paradox is the form of the trap. The crystal does not lie. Every future it shows him is a real, possible death. Every choice he makes does narrow the field. And yet, the closer he gets to the desired ending, the less recognizable he becomes. He becomes ruthless, then cruel, then murderous, then a hollowed-out boy in a wheelchair, speaking through a voice box, still aiming for the bed and the girl. The paradox is, the future the crystal showed him at the start is not the future he is heading for. Each edit changes the field. Each edit changes him. By the time he reaches the bed scene, he is no longer the boy who first looked into the crystal. The crystal showed him a death. The crystal did not show him the cost of obtaining the death. The implication is that perfect foresight, applied to a desired outcome, will eat the person trying to obtain that outcome. You cannot steer toward a future without becoming the kind of person who would steer that hard, and the kind of person who would steer that hard is not the person the future was made for. The episode makes this explicit with the bed scene. The Morty in the bed is technically achieving his goal, and is technically nobody anymore. The death he wanted required him to die long before. The paradox is recursive. Foresight without character is suicide. The show very calmly lets Rick break the crystal at the end and lets Morty walk away with no acknowledgement that he just spent an episode dismantling himself for an outcome he did not actually want. The paradox is in the casual dismissal. Morty does not learn the lesson. The crystal goes away. The desire does not. Every later season, in subtler ways, will show Morty trying to steer toward versions of his life the show implies he would not survive the journey to. The Death Crystal is the simplest version of the trap. The show has been laying versions of that trap for him ever since. At number 19, the Rick-dependent spray paradox. In the Season 5 episode of that name, an attempt to harvest material for cloning leads to the existence of giant incest babies, and the show stages a story in which the family contemplates whether parts of themselves count as family. The paradox is delivered with the show's usual approach to taboo, which is to keep the camera level and let the audience feel uncomfortable. The plot has been remembered by viewers as one of the show's strangest, but the paradox under it is small and real. If a person's biological material exists outside of them, has been combined with somebody else's biological material, and has produced a being, what is that being to them? Is it a child? Is it a stranger? The show, by the end of the episode, signals the family has decided to disown the creatures, that they will not be acknowledged, that the events will be quietly buried. The paradox is the burial. Disowning a child created from your own material does not undo the material. It just declares you have decided not to be a parent to it. The show is staging the question of whether parenthood is biology or choice, and answering, in this case, that it is choice. The being exists. The family chooses not to feel obligated. The episode plays this as a joke. The implication is that several characters in the family have functionally agreed that being a parent is a discretionary state. You can stop being one. You can refuse to be one in the first place. Once you read the episode that way, several other choices in the series read differently. Rick's relationship with Beth is partly the relationship of a man who left and then came back and then asked to be considered a parent again. Beth's relationship with her children, especially in seasons where she splits and one of her leaves to be in space, is partly the relationship of a woman who has decided that being a parent is something she will do part-time. The Rick-dependent spray episode, which looks like the silliest in the show, is the show admitting the entire family treats parenthood as opt-in. The paradox is the show has, multiple times, presented parenthood as the only honest relationship anybody on screen has, and also as a thing every character on screen has tried to walk away from at least once. The show does not resolve this. It lets the giant incest babies be quietly disowned and never returned to, and the family eats dinner. The implication is that any of them could walk out of any of their roles, and on certain bad days would, at number 18, the Children of Mort paradox. In the Season 4 episode Children of Mort, Rick discovers a sentient planet he once impregnated has been raising hundreds of children of his he has never met. The paradox is that, by Rick's own standards, none of these children should exist. He is supposed to be careful. He is supposed to be in control of his own biology. He is supposed to know where his obligations are. And here, on a quiet planet far from Earth, are hundreds of small Ricks with his eyes and his hair and his fingerprints, raised by a mother he barely remembers. The plot of the episode is the family arriving, the children begging Rick to be their father, Rick refusing to stay, and the planet eventually choosing to let them go. The paradox is what the episode is willing to imply about Rick. He has done this. He has done it specifically without remembering it. He has, in the past, slept with sentient planets and walked away. The show is using this as a joke. The implication is the parade of Rick's children, the ones we see in this episode, is only the parade we happen to be watching. Statistically, there must be more. Across a long enough career as Rick, with his level of mobility and his obvious lack of restraint, the show is implying he has produced an unknown number of offspring, scattered across an unknown number of dimensions. The paradox is that he has, in his own life, decided he has one daughter, and that one daughter is Beth, and that any complication of that fact is treated as an interruption. The show is making a quiet argument that Rick's choice of which children matter is purely will. He could matter to more children if he chose to. He has chosen not to. The Children episode lets the planet take her children back, and lets Rick fly home, and the family does not really discuss it. The paradox is the asymmetry. Beth, who has been a daughter to Rick on his terms, watches him refuse to be a father to an entire planet of children, and does not press him on the obvious question, which is whether his fatherhood of her was equally optional. The show implies that she does not want to know the answer. The paradox is in the silence between them. Rick has children he could have. He has decided he has one. Beth has decided to accept the decision. They eat dinner. At number 17, the Forgetting Sarek Mortshall paradox. In the Season 5 episode of that name, Morty undergoes a procedure to forget about a former girlfriend, so completely the memory has been edited out of his head. The paradox is delivered as a slowly mounting horror. The procedure is too thorough. It erases not just the relationship, but every association that touches it, every memory of every event that occurred near the relationship, every connection that runs through that part of his mind. Morty starts losing himself piece by piece. The paradox is what the procedure exposes about identity. Morty's memory of one girlfriend is connected to thousands of other moments. Pulling the thread of her out of his mind unravels his sense of his own life. By the time the episode is in its second act, he is functionally a different boy. The implication is that a person is not the sum of their large memories. A person is the network of associations between them, and a single removed thread can flatten the rest. The episode plays this for tension. The deeper paradox is the question of whether anything we go through can be safely removed. The show is making a claim that memories are load-bearing. The girlfriend Morty wanted to forget was holding up parts of him he was not aware of. Take her out, and parts of him fall. The implication is that grief, in the show's own logic, is not a removable feature. You cannot simply delete the things you do not want to feel anymore. They are, by the structure of personality, holding the rest of you in place. The episode wraps with Morty getting the memory restored and going on with his life with the grief intact. The paradox is the warning. Other characters in the show have tried more partial versions of the same procedure. Rick, in particular, is implied to have erased entire stretches of his own past. By the Forgetting Sarek rule, Rick should be unstable. Removing as much as he claims to have removed should have flattened him. The fact that he is still functional is either the show being inconsistent or the show implying Rick is, in some structural way, an exception to the memory rule. The paradox is unresolved. The show says memories cannot be safely removed and then shows you a man who has removed many of his, and asks you to accept both at once. The most generous read is that Rick is barely holding himself together, that he is functionally the same kind of damage the Forgetting Sarek procedure would have produced, and that his stability is a costume rather than a real condition. By this view, every season is the show watching a man whose memory has been edited down to a thinness no normal person could carry, and asking how long that costume can hold. At number 16, the Vat of Acid paradox. In the Season 4 episode, the Vat of Acid episode, Morty asks Rick for a save and load mechanism in real life. He wants to be able to live out a moment, undo it if he does not like it, and try again. Rick, with a particular kind of disgust, gives him exactly what he asked for, but with a twist Morty does not realize until much later. The save and load device is not a save and load device. It is a kill and clone device. Every time Morty hits the button, the current Morty dies, and a previous Morty is generated forward into the new moment with all the memories of every previous run. The episode tracks Morty through dozens of small attempts to optimize his life, then through a single attempt at a long, meaningful relationship which he lives out in full for years, and then erases by saving back to the beginning. The paradox is what that means. Morty, during the long relationship, was a complete person who lived a full life. He died when Morty hit the button. From his point of view, his life ended in a flash of light he did not see coming. From the new Morty's point of view, he gained the memories of a life that to him was a story. The paradox is that the device is a serial killer dressed as a piece of furniture. Every save erases a man who was, for that period, a real person. Morty uses it without realizing. The episode reveals the truth in its last act and lets Morty understand what he has done. The paradox is the realization that every quick fix offered in the show is structured the same way. Cronenberg Burial is a kill and clone. Operation Phoenix is a kill and clone. Beth's clone procedure is, depending on which side you read it from, a kill and clone. The vat of acid device is the show telling you, with extreme clarity, what it has been doing all along. Every comfort the show offers is built on a corpse. Every quick fix the show grants is the death of a version of the person who chose it. Morty's grief at the end of the episode is the grief of every other character in the series catching up to him for one moment. The paradox is the show does not let him keep that grief. It snaps back to the formula in the next episode. Morty goes on. The lesson is implied to stick, but the structure of the show does not let it. Every subsequent quick fix Morty agrees to participate in is technically the same problem. The Vat of Acid episode is the show telling its own lead, on screen, what kind of show he is in. He listens, he understands, and the show keeps going. At number 15, the Rattlestar Ricklactica Paradox. The Season 4 episode Rattlestar Ricklactica builds an entire civilization of snakes, and then has them invent time travel. And the episode spends most of its runtime on the snake side, watching snake astronauts go back in time to prevent the snake war, and then watching different snake factions go back in time to undo the prevention, and then watching more snake factions go back to undo the undoing, until the timeline collapses into a kind of slithering knot. The paradox the episode plays with on screen is the grandfather paradox, and it does so by dragging it to a level of absurdity that strips away any defensive posture you might have about it. The snakes go back. They kill their own ancestors. They negate themselves. Other snakes go back to undo the kill. The new snakes negate them. The show, with surprising patience, lets all of it play out in snake costumes and snake dialogue and snake funerals. The paradox is the implication for the main timeline. If time travel is possible in this universe, and a small civilization of snakes can build it within a few decades of their first contact with it, then any larger civilization, which is most civilizations in this show, can build it whenever it wants to. There should be, by simple arithmetic, hundreds of overlapping factions across the multiverse, going back in time to undo and redo the events the show is watching. The reason Rick and Morty's timeline appears stable is either that no faction has bothered with it, which is implausible, or that interference is happening constantly and the show is simply not portraying it. The implication is the latter. The episode opens that door with the snakes and then closes it on the way out. The paradox is that, after Rattlestar Ricklactica, every quiet moment in the show could be a moment that has been edited by an off-screen time travel intervention. The Smiths sitting on a couch could be sitting on a couch placed there by a faction we will never meet. The audience cannot test it. The show cannot prove it. And by the show's own demonstration in the snake episode, it is clearly possible. The deeper paradox is the philosophical one. If time can be edited, then any present moment is the surviving option from a field of edited moments. The thing you are currently feeling is a thing somebody decided, somewhere, you should be feeling. That is true for the snakes. It is true for the family. The show does not say this directly. It simply lets the snake civilization annihilate itself and replaces them with a single, exhausted snake walking home, and lets you take the implication into the rest of the series. At number 14, the Never Ricking Morty Paradox. The Season 4 episode Never Ricking Morty is structured as a meta-narrative, in which Rick and Morty find themselves on a story train where every car is a different self-contained anthology piece, and where their attempts to escape the train are constantly defeated by the fact the train is a structure that wants stories, and they are the only stories on board. The paradox is the episode is openly aware of being an episode. The characters are aware of being characters. The escape attempts are openly described as attempts to break out of the form they are in. The conductor of the train is a character whose entire job is to keep the show running. The paradox the episode states is that any escape attempt becomes another story, and any story is fuel for the train. There is no way out of a structure whose hunger is satisfied by attempts to escape it. The implication for the show is enormous. The series is openly admitting that it is a show, that the characters are aware they are in a show, that the writers know the characters know, and that this is the trap. Anything Rick does to escape the storytelling structure of his own life becomes another piece of the storytelling structure. The episode resolves with the discovery that the train is being run by a man named Storylord, and with Rick managing to disengage the train by collapsing it into pure meta-narrative which Storylord cannot survive. The paradox is that even this resolution is itself a story, the kind of clever genre escape Rick has performed many times before. The trap is unbeatable. The Never Ricking Morty paradox is the show telling you, with full deliberateness, that it knows it is a show, that its characters know they are characters, and that there is no honest way to act on this knowledge except to keep producing more show. The reading is darkly funny and structurally complete. Rick, who in earlier seasons reacted to evidence of his fictionality with sarcasm, in this episode reacts to it with weariness. He has been here before, he will be here again. The story train is the universe he lives in. The paradox is unresolvable from the inside. The most honest thing the episode does is end on the family back at the table, telling jokes, and let the implication sit there. They are still inside the train. They will always be inside the train. The story train is what we call the show. The audience is the conductor. At number 13, The A Wrinkle in Time Paradox. The Season 2 premiere A Wrinkle in Time picks up where the Season 1 finale Rixie business left off, with the world having been frozen in time as the result of a freeze ray Rick used to clean up the house party. The thaw goes wrong. Rick, Morty, and Summer end up trapped in a quantum superposition, with reality split into branches that multiply each time they argue. The visual is striking and was, when it aired, almost unprecedented in animation. The screen literally splits, sometimes into more than a dozen panels, each showing a slightly different version of the same characters making slightly different choices. The paradox the episode plays with is observer-dependent collapse. Reality stays split until the characters agree on what just happened. Until they agree, every version is technically real. The implication, which the show enacts and then walks away from, is that the act of remembering is the act of choosing which version of yourself is true. While the panels are visible, all versions are alive. Once the panels collapse, the surviving version is the one whose memory becomes the canonical past. The earlier versions, by definition, were also real, but they are now gone. The episode is the show describing, with extreme care, what it has been doing to the audience for 2 seasons. The audience watches a single version of events because the camera collapses the panels and stays with one. The other panels were real while they were visible. They are not anymore. The paradox is, the show has confessed it picks a canonical reality out of many simultaneously real ones, and that the reality you watch on screen is the one the show has decided to make canonical. The audience does not get to choose which panel. The show does. The reading is striking. Every later season is the show navigating between simultaneous possibilities and showing you only the one the camera has decided to keep. The reasons for the choices are not always given. Sometimes a panel disappears. Sometimes a Rick we glimpsed for a frame is never mentioned again. The Wrinkle in Time paradox is the show admitting, in animation, that this is the rule. The audience is watching a single thread pulled out of a very tangled rope. The other threads do not stop existing because the camera moves away from them. They simply stop being shown. At number 12, The Mort Dinner Rick Andre Paradox. The Season 5 premiere Mort Dinner Rick Andre opens with Morty trapped in a wine-making dimension in Rick's basement, where time runs much faster than on Earth. Morty enters the dimension to age a single bottle of wine, accidentally lives an entire life there, becomes embroiled in centuries of political intrigue, returns. The paradox is the casualness of the device. Rick has, in his house, a dimension in which a human being can live a complete life in the time it takes to set a table. The implication is Rick possesses, without remarking on it, a piece of technology that could solve every problem the show has ever portrayed. He could put any character in the dimension. He could give any guest a full second life. He could put himself in there and live 1,000 years between breakfasts. He does not. He uses it for wine. The paradox is the disuse. The show implies, without arguing the point, that Rick has many devices like this and uses almost none of them to their potential. He has tools that could fix the world. He uses them to age fermented beverages. The reading is precise and almost unbearable. Rick is not a man who lacks the means to make the universe better. He is a man who has decided that improving the universe is not a project he is interested in. Mort Dinner Rick Andre is the show stating this on screen and then never saying it out loud. The wine ages. Morty comes back older, having lived another life, and the family sits down to eat. The paradox extends to Morty. He lived a life in there. By the rules the show has built across multiple episodes about clones and vat of acid and multiplicity, the man who lived that life inside the dimension is, by every available measure, dead. Morty came back with his memories. The man who experienced them is gone. Morty, in this episode, has become the saved file. The previous Morty is the deleted run. The show does not flag this. It has spent enough episodes flagging it that it does not need to. The implication is now the floor of the show. Every quick adventure in this universe is leaving behind some version of the person who took it. And the only Morty who walks out is the one whose memories the writers have decided to keep. Mort Dinner Rick Andre is the polite version of this paradox dressed as a dinner party. At number 11, the Ricka Mortwell Lived paradox. The season 6 episode Ricka Mortwell Lived returns to the territory of the Roy arcade game from Morty Night Run, but takes it much further. The episode places Rick inside a simulation in which a single character has been trapped for centuries of subjective time, building a religion around the idea that they are inside a video game and that one day someone will come and free them. By the time Rick arrives, the prisoner has aged, married, raised children, and become an old man. He has lived a complete life inside what is, on the outside, a brief shooter game. The paradox is what Extraction does to him. The outside world, by the rules of the simulation, is real. The inside world, by his experience, was real. Both sides are real. The man who is rescued is older than the man who entered, but he is being told the older life did not happen. The show plays this with the bluntness it usually reserves for the Vat of Acid episode. The rescue does not give the man his old life back. It takes the long life away from him. The paradox is the bookkeeping. The simulation was a story, but the story was also a life. Both descriptions are correct. The show is making, again, the same argument it has made through Roy and through the Vat of Acid and through the time chamber. Time spent inside a constructed reality counts. The person who lives it is real. Removing them is killing them. Ricka Mortwell Lived takes the argument and presents it without the comedy buffer. The man who lived inside the simulation is treated as a real person, whose death by extraction matters. The paradox is the parallel to the audience. Television, for a viewer, is a simulation of the same kind. You spend hours inside the lives of these characters. You age in real time while they live in production cycles. The show is, in this episode, very gently asking you to consider whether the life you are spending in front of the screen is a life. The Roy arcade game was the joke version. The Vat of Acid was the philosophical version. Ricka Mortwell Lived is the version that looks straight at the audience and does not blink. The paradox is unresolved. The show does not tell you whether the simulated life mattered exactly. It just gives the simulated man a quiet ending that implies it did, and leaves you to decide what that means for the time you have spent inside its own simulation. The reading is brutal in its quietness. Every viewer is, by this episode's logic, partly Roy. At number 10, the Roy paradox. The original. The arcade game called Roy A Life Well Lived appears in the Season 2 episode Morty Night Run, and it is presented as a casual diversion in a single corner of an alien arcade. Morty plays it. He sinks into the chair, dons the headset, and lives a full life as a man named Roy. He grows up, he gets a job at a carpet store, he meets a woman, he marries her, he raises a son. The son dies. Roy gets cancer. Roy survives cancer by going back to the carpet store, in a small, defiant gesture against entropy. Roy ages. Roy dies in his sleep, an old man, in a bed in a small house, with a life behind him. Morty rips off the headset, gets up, and walks away. The paradox is everything inside that 30 seconds. Morty has lived a complete subjective life. He has, by his own felt experience, just been an old man in a quiet bed. He stands up as Morty, a teenage boy, with no apparent integration of what he has just been. The arcade clerk has seen him score moderately well. The show plays it as light texture, in a wider story about gas creatures and assassins. The paradox is the calmness of the dismissal. Morty was an old man 5 seconds ago. Now he is a teenager. The line between those two experiences is a piece of arcade machinery in an alien shop. The implication, which the show will not develop until much later seasons, is that subjective time is the basic currency the show is willing to spend without comment. Rick will toss it, Morty will spend it, nobody will count it. By the rules the show eventually builds, the Roy who lived is a person who lived. Killing him by ripping off a headset is killing a man. The episode is a corpse the show smiles past. The paradox is also what Morty does not do. He does not break down. He does not refuse to play the game again. He does not ask Rick to explain how the machine could possibly be ethical. He plays it and gets up and goes on. The implication is something in Morty has already, by the second season, grown the kind of callous that lets him absorb the death of a life he has just lived. Rick has been training him in this since the Cronenberg burial. By Morty Night Run, the training is taking. Roy is the first time the show invites you to notice that Morty has become a child who can be a man for 50 years and then put down the controller without crying. The arcade game pays it off in much later episodes. Rick, a Mort well-lived, returns to the device and takes it seriously. Forgetting Sarek Mortshall returns to it sideways. The Vat of Acid episode returns to it in disguise. The Roy arcade game is the seed of an entire moral problem the show keeps coming back to. And the paradox is that it was placed in the show as a background gag in a relatively casual second season hour. The show planted a question and let it sit there for a decade. At number 9, the 60 Minutes Paradox. The first season episode 60 Minutes is constructed in two parallel halves. In one half, Rick gives Jerry, Beth, and Summer a set of goggles that lets each of them watch the lives of their alternate selves across the multiverse. In the other half, Rick and Morty watch hours of interdimensional cable. The interdimensional cable half is freeform improv. The goggles half is the heart of the episode. Jerry sees a version of himself who became a famous actor, in a happy marriage to a famous actress version of Beth. Beth sees a version of herself who became a surgeon for humans rather than horses, who lives in a beautiful apartment, who is alone. Summer sees a version of herself who was never born, because her parents made different choices on the night she would have been conceived. Each character is offered a window into the lives they could have had. The paradox is what each of them does with it. Jerry is destabilist. Beth is destabilist. Summer is destabilist. Each of them, in their own way, has been confronted with the structural fact that their current life is one of an infinity of possible lives, and that there is no honest sense in which their current life is the best one. The episode resolves with Morty, of all people, talking Summer down with the line, "Nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. Everybody is going to die. Come watch TV." He delivers it from the floor of her bedroom, in a hoodie, looking exhausted. The paradox is the source of the wisdom. Morty, the youngest person in the family, the one who looks the least equipped to handle this kind of question, is the only one in the house with the answer to it. The reason, which the show does not say but lets you assemble, is that Morty has already been through this. He is a boy who lived through the Cronenberg burial. He is a boy who has, by this point in the series, already had to absorb the multiversal indifference of his own life. He is the only one in the house who has practiced this. The paradox is that the speech he gives Summer, which has become one of the most quoted moments in the show, is the speech of a boy who has been broken in advance by a Rick the audience has watched destroy him. Morty is calm because he has nothing left to be unsettled by. He has already accepted that none of this is for any of them. The line is not wisdom, it is exhaustion. 60 Minutes is the show portraying the first moment that exhaustion went public. Every later moment when Morty seems unfazed by something that would devastate a normal person is a continuation of that same exhausted calm. The paradox is in the family's reaction. They take comfort from Morty's collapse and call it perspective. The show does not correct them. At number 8, the Morty's Mind Blowers Paradox. The Season 3 episode Morty's Mind Blowers is built around the discovery that Rick has, for years, been removing painful memories from Morty's head and storing them in glass jars in a hidden vault. The episode lets us see some of the memories. Each one is a small, specific moment that broke Morty in a way he could not carry. The paradox is the vault. It exists. Morty did not know it existed. The jars are labeled with summaries of what was taken. Rick has, the show implies, taken hundreds. The paradox is what that means for Morty's continuous sense of being himself. The memories were removed. The personality that was shaped by the memories at the moment they happened is not the personality Morty currently has. Rick has been, in the most literal sense, editing the boy. He has not been editing the boy with malice. He has been doing it as maintenance. The implication is Morty would not still be functional without the vault. He would have collapsed somewhere along the line. Rick has kept him going by taking pieces of what hurt him and locking them away. The paradox is that this is, depending on your read, either the cruelest thing Rick has ever done or the kindest. The show does not say which. The episode lets Morty discover the vault, lets him read some of the jars, lets him panic, lets Rick wipe both of their memories of the discovery at the end so the structure can continue. The paradox is recursive. Rick has wiped his own memories too. He has, in this episode, deleted his own knowledge of having spent the night in the vault. By the show's logic, the man Rick is the next morning is not exactly the man who went to bed. He is a slightly edited successor. The implication is that this has been happening to both of them for years. The show implies, very quietly, that the family Rick lives with is in part the result of constant invisible memory management. He keeps the household stable by tampering with it. He keeps Morty functional by tampering with him. He keeps himself functional by tampering with himself. The paradox is that the show frames this as a domestic horror story and then walks back into the formula in the next episode, with no acknowledgement of what was revealed. The vault stays. The jars are presumably still being filled. Every time something terrible happens to Morty after this episode, the implication is that, on a long enough timeline, a piece of that terrible thing might get locked in a jar by an exhausted grandfather. The show does not return to the vault often. It does not have to. The vault is in the back of the garage. It is in the back of the show. At number 7, the Rickternal Friendshine Paradox. The Season 5 episode Rickternal Friendshine of the Spotless Mort sends Rick into the inside of Bird Person's mind to retrieve the original consciousness. The episode is a structured look at memories of the friendship between Rick and Bird Person, a friendship the early seasons hinted at and never explored. The paradox is the way the memories are constructed. They are not Bird Person's. They are how Rick remembers them. Or, more precisely, they are how Bird Person remembers them, after Rick has spent years remembering them at Bird Person, until both versions of the friendship have merged. The episode shows Rick navigating a mind that has, in some ways, been edited by his presence in it. The paradox is Rick is technically inside a memory he has helped shape. The original Bird Person, the one buried under the cyborg programming, is not exactly the man Rick is going to bring back. He is the man who has been preserved in the form of Rick's memory of him, modified by Bird Person's own memory of having those experiences with Rick. The reading is precise. The Bird Person we get back is, in part, a Bird Person Rick has constructed. The episode does not present this as a problem. It presents it as a tender thing. The paradox is whether tenderness is enough. Rick is essentially editing a man back into existence using the memories Rick wants him to have. The Bird Person who walks out of the mind at the end of the episode is, by every meaningful measure, the Bird Person Rick missed. Whether he is the same Bird Person Rick lost is an open question. The show implies, without insisting, that the answer does not matter. Rick has him back. The deeper paradox is the implication for memory in general. If a friendship is preserved in part by the way each friend remembers it, then every long friendship is a partly fabricated thing. Friends edit each other. They remember each other selectively. Each one carries a version of the other that is partly their own work. The Rickternal Friendshine episode is the show portraying the editing process literally, with Rick walking around the inside of a friend's head and choosing which rooms to keep. The paradox is unflinching. The show does not pretend this is a clean process. It just lets Rick do it, lets him hold his friend's mind in his hands, and lets him decide what version of his oldest companion gets to walk out into the world. The reading is that everybody does a version of this in their own friendships and their own grief, and the difference is just that Rick has the technology to do it visibly. The paradox lands because the editing is not hidden. The episode shows it. The show implies, gently, it would be happening anyway. At number 6, the Solarix Paradox. The Season 6 premiere Solarix reverses the central comfort the show has been running on since the Cronenberg burial. Rick Prime, the man who killed our Rick's original wife and daughter, has activated a system that sends every displaced person across the multiverse back to their original reality. Our Rick, who has been living for years in the universe he Cronenberged into, is suddenly returned to his original universe. Our Morty, who has been with our Rick since the Cronenberg burial, is sent back to his own real family, which is still alive, which has been wondering what happened to him for years. Our Jerry is sent back to his own original Earth. The premiere splits into 3 storylines, each tracking the displaced characters' return to a home they had stopped thinking of as home. The paradox is the form of the reversal. The show has spent years allowing the audience to believe the family on screen is the family. The Solarix episode reveals that, in the official internal continuity of the show, the family on screen is not the family. Morty is not the original Morty of this house. He has been a substitute. The original Morty of this house has been gone since Season 1, replaced by the boy we have been watching. The Morty we have been watching is the surviving boy from the original Cronenberg universe, who has been pretending to be the boy of a different family since he was 13. The Solarix episode hands him a mirror. He sees his real parents again, who are not the parents we have been watching. He understands, in a way the show has rarely allowed him to admit, what the burial actually meant. The paradox is the choice he makes. He chooses to leave his real family behind and go back to the Smith family. The Smith family that is not actually his. The Smith family he has been pretending to belong to for years. The reading is heartbreaking. Morty does not have a home in the original sense. He has a home he has built through habit and love with a family that is not strictly his. He chooses the built home over the original one. The show implies with as much gentleness as it can muster that the built home is now the real home. Habit and love have made it so. The paradox is also Rick's. Rick is returned to the universe where his original Beth died. He stands in the empty house. He has not been there in years. He looks at it as it is now. He leaves. He goes back to the Smith family in the substitute universe, because that too is now his home. The Solarix episode is the show finally collapsing the Cronenberg paradox by allowing the characters to acknowledge it. They know. They have always known. They have chosen this anyway. The paradox is the choice. The implication for the audience is that the family we have been watching has been a chosen family, in the most literal sense since the first season. Every meal, every fight, every moment of affection has been between people who are not biologically the people they appear to be, and who have, over time, decided biology does not get to be the rule. The Solarix paradox is, finally, the show telling you it loves these people anyway, and asking whether you do too. At number 5. The Citadel Paradox. The Citadel of Rix is the floating city of Rix and Mortis, introduced in the first season, and explored in much greater depth across later seasons, most notably in the third season episode, The Ricklantis Mix-Up. The premise is that infinite Ricks across infinite realities, having all reached a particular kind of bitter god mode, have built themselves a city in which they can live together. Each Rick is paired with a Morty. Some Mortys go to schools designed for Mortis. Some Ricks work shifts. Some Mortys are homeless. Some Ricks run for office. The Citadel is, by the show's own design, a structural impossibility dressed as a sociological cartoon. The paradox is the contradiction at the heart of the place. Rick's whole personality is built around the claim that he is the smartest man in the universe. The Citadel is full of men with the same claim. They cannot all be right. The show very pointedly lets this be a problem. The Ricks in the Citadel are not all equal. There are wage Ricks. There are political Ricks. There are Ricks doing dirty work. There are Ricks getting rich off other Ricks. There are Ricks killing other Ricks. The implication, which the show makes through the structure rather than through dialogue, is the Citadel is not a community of equals. It is a hierarchy of the same man, with different versions of himself, sorted into roles he has, in another life, looked down on. Every Rick in the Citadel is somebody who, on his own Earth, considered himself special. In the Citadel, he is one of many. The paradox is what that does to the meaning of being Rick. If there are infinite Ricks, none of them are special. If none of them are special, none of them are what Rick has spent his life claiming to be. The Citadel is the place where Rick's personality dies. Our Rick understands this. He refuses to live there. He hates the Citadel. He has, more than once, tried to destroy it. The reading is that the Citadel is a mirror Rick will not look in for too long. Looking in confirms he is not the only one. Looking in confirms his entire identity is a coincidence of position rather than a fact of nature. The Ricklantis mix-up deepens the paradox by spending an entire episode showing you a city full of Ricks and Mortys in which our Rick and Morty are not present, and showing you the city is full of people whose interior lives are as detailed as the family on Earth. There are Mortys with crushes. There are Ricks running for office on populist platforms. There are dead Mortys whose deaths matter to other Mortys. The episode forces you to admit the Smith family is not unique. The Smith family is one of millions of Smith families. The grief, the wit, the small accomplishments of our family are happening simultaneously in millions of houses. The paradox is what that should do to the audience's investment. By rigorous accounting, our family does not deserve more of your attention than any other Smith family. The show keeps your attention on them anyway, because the camera is on them, because the writers chose them, because the story train decided. The Citadel paradox is the structural argument the show has no right to claim its protagonists matter, and the show's own refusal to act on that argument. We watch them because we have decided to watch them. There is no more rigorous reason than that. The Citadel is the place where that thinness is exposed. It is also the place that, by the end of Season 3, gets quietly destroyed by another character on the list, in a way that does not solve the paradox, but reframes it. Killing every other Rick does not make our Rick the smartest. It just makes him the last visible one. The paradox sits there. The show keeps walking past it. At number 4. The Evil Morty Paradox. Evil Morty appears first in the first season episode Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, in which it is revealed that a serial killer who has been murdering Ricks is being secretly piloted by a Morty wearing an eye patch, hiding behind a Rick shell. The reveal is delivered in the last few seconds of the episode. Evil Morty disappears at the end, and is not seen again until the third season episode, The Ricklantis Mix-Up, where he runs for office in the Citadel under a charismatic, optimistic, deeply scripted persona, wins the election, takes power, and quietly executes the Ricks he can tell will resist him. He resurfaces in the 5th season finale Rick Mirai Jack, where he reveals that he has spent his entire political career arranging the means to destroy the central finite curve, and where he succeeds. The paradox of evil Morty is the question of which Morty he is. The show has been deliberately ambiguous about his origin. Some theories suggest he is a Morty who endured a particularly cruel Rick. Some suggest he is a Morty who outgrew his Rick. Some suggest he is a Morty whose Rick died and who had to learn to do without one. The show, in Rick Murray Jack, gives him a monologue that gestures toward all of these possibilities without confirming any one of them. He describes a Morty who got tired of being a sidekick, who understood the cosmic structure that produced the Rick and Morty dynamic, and who decided to refuse it. The paradox is precise and brutal. Every Morty in the multiverse is, by structural assumption, a sidekick. The system requires them to be. The central finite curve, the show eventually reveals, is a region of the multiverse curated to contain only realities in which Rick is the smartest man in the universe. By implication, every Morty in this region is the dim grandson of the smartest man in the universe. Their narrative role is determined by their family position. Evil Morty is the one who noticed. The paradox is that any Morty could, in principle, have noticed. The fact that almost none of them did is partly the show implying the system is sticky. That being trained from birth to be a sidekick produces a person who cannot easily imagine being anything else. Evil Morty is the rare exception, and the show treats his existence as both an indictment of the system and a celebration of its escape valves. The implication, which the show plays with quietly, is that our Morty might be becoming Evil Morty too. He is older now, he is more competent. He is less afraid of Rick. He has, on multiple occasions, performed the kind of cold tactical decision making the show used to reserve for Rick alone. The paradox is whether the show is letting our Morty walk toward the same revelation Evil Morty had years earlier. If so, the difference between them is not destiny, it is timing. Evil Morty is the Morty who realized earlier. Our Morty is the Morty who is realizing more slowly. The reading is precise. Both of them are products of the same system, and both of them, on a long enough timeline, are likely to take similar routes out of it. The show has not confirmed this, but it has not denied it either. Evil Morty's escape from the central finite curve is, by every available reading, the most consequential single act in the history of the show. He left. He stepped outside the system. He is presumably now somewhere the show has not committed to in detail. The paradox is what it means that he was able to. If the system was that escapable, then the system was that constructed. If the system was that constructed, then the show is openly admitting the world its protagonists live in is a curated illusion built for the convenience of a few high-status Ricks. Evil Morty, by leaving, has confirmed it. The paradox is what the show does with that information. It keeps going. The Smith family continues to live in the curated illusion, with the show fully aware the illusion has been pierced. The implication is the family lives there by choice, or by inertia, or by being too tired to leave. The paradox of Evil Morty is that he is, in many ways, the most rational character the show has ever produced, and that the show is built in such a way that the most rational character has to be the antagonist. The reading is honest. The show has been quietly admitting for a decade that its premise is suspect, and that any character who took the premise seriously would have to leave the show. Evil Morty took it seriously. Evil Morty left. The show goes on. At number 3, the central finite curve paradox. The central finite curve is named, on screen, in the Season 5 finale Rick Murray Jack. The reveal is delivered as Evil Morty's central explanation for what he has spent his political career doing. The central finite curve, the show says, is a region of the multiverse that has been walled off from the larger multiverse by an agreement among Ricks. Inside the curve, every reality contains a Rick who is the smartest man in the universe. Outside the curve, there are realities in which Ricks are not the smartest. Some of them might not be alive. Some of them might not exist. The Ricks of the curve, who set up the boundary in the distant past, did so to make sure the version of the multiverse each Rick lived in was one in which his status was guaranteed. The paradox is the size of the lie. Every Rick in the curve has spent his life believing he is the smartest man in the universe. He has, in many cases, been bitter about this fact, has felt the loneliness of being above other people, has used the belief as a justification for everything from cruelty to despair. The central finite curve reveal is the show telling every Rick on screen that this claim was rigged. The universe was filtered to make it true. The status that Rick has built his personality on is a result of selection bias. Take any Rick outside the curve, and he is, possibly, just a man. The implication is enormous for our Rick specifically. Every monologue he has given about being smarter than the universe, every decision he has justified by his own genius, every relationship he has wrecked by claiming intellectual superiority is now retroactively complicated. He was the smartest man in this universe because somebody set the boundary so that he would be. The paradox is whether he knew. The show implies, with deliberate ambiguity, that he might have. Rick has the kind of arrogance that is the right size for a man who knows the deck has been stacked in his favor. He has the kind of self-loathing that fits a man who knows his own importance is constructed. The reveal that the curve exists fits him too cleanly to be a surprise to him. The show does not say whether he was part of the original group that walled it off. It implies, in the back of certain shots, that he might have been. The paradox is what Rick does with this knowledge after it becomes public. Evil Morty breaks the curve at the end of Rick Mirai Jack. The boundary collapses. The walled-off region is open to the larger multiverse. By the structure the show has built, Rick is no longer guaranteed to be the smartest man in any room he walks into. The episodes that follow do not lean into this. The next season opens with the Solarix plotline, which has its own concerns. The curve is referenced, but not centrally engaged with. The implication is, Rick is now living in an unrigged multiverse, and is, very calmly, choosing not to ask the new questions about his own status. The paradox is the avoidance. The show has handed Rick the most destabilizing information possible about himself, and watched him refuse to interrogate it. He keeps drinking. He keeps building. He keeps treating Morty like Morty. The implication is Rick had built so much of his life on his guaranteed status that the revelation the status was constructed has not changed his behavior. He continues being Rick because he does not know how to stop. The central finite curve paradox is the show describing with extraordinary precision what selection bias does to a person who has lived his life inside it. He cannot, in any meaningful sense, leave the bias. He has become the bias. The show implies this is also true of every other Rick in the curve, that none of them will adjust, that all of them will keep being the kind of men they had been before the wall came down. The reading is heavy. The central finite curve was not just a structure in the multiverse. It was a structure inside Rick. Removing the outer structure has not removed the inner one. The paradox is that Rick is now technically free and is functionally still trapped. The cage was a habit. The habit is the cage. At number 2, the Rick Prime paradox. Rick Prime is the version of Rick who, in the deep backstory of our Rick, killed our Rick's original wife Diane and his original daughter Beth. Our Rick has spent decades chasing him across the multiverse, building portal technology in part to be able to track him, choosing his entire adult life around the project of finding the man who killed his family. Rick Prime is the reason our Rick is the man he is. He is the founding wound. He is the engine. He is the thing that explains, in one sentence, why a brilliant scientist would also be a broken alcoholic with no patience for his own family. Rick Prime is finally killed by our Rick on screen in the Season 7 episode Unmortrican, and the death is unsentimental. Our Rick walks up to him, in a moment of structural advantage, and ends him with no monologue, no final exchange, no grand reckoning. The paradox is what the death does to our Rick. By every internal rule the show has been building for years, killing Rick Prime should be the end of the journey. The reason our Rick has spent his life building portal guns, the reason he has been a terrible father, the reason he has been a present grandfather, the reason he drinks, the reason he lashes out, the reason he has stayed alive when by his own admission he would rather not have, is to one day arrive at the moment where he stands over the body of the man who killed his family. Unmortrican delivers that moment. Our Rick is alive at the end of it. Rick Prime is dead. And our Rick is, by every reading of the episode, no better. He is not relieved. He is not free. He is not restored. He goes back to his life. He has a drink. He sits in the garage. He tells Morty almost nothing. The paradox is the structure has collapsed. The reason for everything is gone. The reason did not redeem him. It only ran out. The implication is the cruelest thing the show has ever said about revenge. Revenge promises that the violence at the end will somehow undo the violence at the beginning. It cannot. The man you kill at the end of the journey is not the man who hurt you at the start. The man you kill at the end is a different person, in a different state, with different fingerprints. Killing him does not bring back what you lost. It does not even make you sleep better. It just gives you back the time you used to spend looking. The paradox is what our Rick does with that return time. The show has not, at the time of writing, definitively answered this. Unmortrican implies he will go back to being Rick. He has Morty. He has Beth. He has the substitute Smith family. He has the things he built around the absence of the original family. He will, presumably, live in that built life until it breaks or he does. The reading is unspeakably heavy. The show has spent 10 years using the Rick Prime quest as a hidden engine for the entire series. And when the quest ends, the engine does not produce a transformation. It produces an idol. Rick is now a man without a reason for being who he is. He is still being that man anyway. The paradox is whether he could be anything else if he tried. The Tiny Rick episode implied he could not. The Pickle Rick episode implied he could not. The Vat of Acid episode implied he could not. Unmortrican confirms it. He has, in his hand, the version of his life he has been working toward. And he has discovered that the work was the version of his life. There is no other version waiting for him. He has been the man who chases Rick Prime so long that the chase was the man. Removing the chase has not produced a new man. It has produced an old man with no project. The paradox is deeper than revenge. It is the paradox of identity built around grief. Many people build their personalities, partly around a wound. The wound becomes the architecture. Removing the wound does not return the original building. It removes the building too. Our Rick is, after Unmortrican, a structure missing a wall. He has not fallen, he is just no longer the same shape. The show implies he will eventually have to decide what kind of shape he is going to be next. It does not tell us what he picks. The deeper paradox of Rick Prime is also the question of who he was, exactly. The show has been deliberately careful about not letting Rick Prime become a person you understand. He has been kept as a silhouette, a method, a result. His motivations are gestured at and never confirmed. The implication, which the show has been quietly building for years, is that Rick Prime is what every Rick could have been without a Morty. He is the version of the genius who took the implications of the central finite curve, of the multiverse, of the limitlessness of his own ability, all the way to the bottom, and made a personality out of the bottom. He has no family. He has no attachment. He has no project except the negation of attachment. He killed our Rick's family in part because, by his understanding, attachments were the only real cage in a universe of infinite copies. He wanted no Rick to be tied to anything. He wanted every Rick to be free in the way he had made himself free. The paradox is, our Rick, in killing him, has also, in a sense, ended the only Rick who took freedom seriously. The Rick Prime philosophy died with him. The other Ricks of the Citadel, of the curve, of the multiverse, are nominally free, but have built themselves households and routines and grudges. Our Rick is the same. He has a family. He has a Morty. He has a garage. He has a daughter. He has spent years trying to love properly. He is not Rick Prime. He never could have become Rick Prime, because his original family was killed by the time he might have considered the option. The paradox of Rick Prime is the paradox of what our Rick might have been if his life had taken him elsewhere. The show implies, very gently, he might have been something not so different from the man he just killed. The wound made him a better man. The wound made him a worse man. Both things are true. Killing the man who made the wound has not resolved either. The paradox sits there at the end of Unmortrican with the empty glass on the table. At number 1, the paradox of who Rick actually is now. This is the largest paradox the show has built. It is the one that absorbs every other paradox on this list, and the one the show has been quietly running on since the second season. The question, very simply, is which Rick we are watching, and whether the show is willing to ever tell us. The early seasons gave him a designation, C137, and let the audience treat that as his identity. The Cronenberg episode showed that he and Morty moved from one reality to another in the first season. The Solarix episode confirmed, much later, that the Rick we have been following is in fact still the original C137 Rick of the original universe, and that our Morty is the original Morty of the original Cronenberg universe, who has been with C137 ever since. The Beth situation is more complicated. The ABCs of Beth created two Beths. The Bethic Twinstinct episode confirmed they both still exist. The show has, at various points, declined to clarify which Beth is in the kitchen on any given week. Jerry has been moved across universes by Rick more than once. The exact membership of the family on screen at any given moment is, by the show's own internal records, a moving target. The paradox is what this does to the basic stability of the show's identity. The show is about a family. The family is, in its parts, swappable and has been swapped. The show has refused to settle who exactly is at the table. The implication is the show has decided this question is unanswerable on purpose, and that the audience is being asked to love a family whose precise identity is, by design, indeterminate. The reading is striking. Television is, conventionally, about stable identities. We watch a show to spend time with people who, week to week, are the same people. Rick and Morty has spent a decade undermining this convention while pretending to honor it. The family on screen looks the same. The voice acting, mostly, has been the same. The animation style has been the same. The internal structure of the family relationships has been the same. But the show has, in repeated episodes, told us that the actual identity of these people is not as fixed as their behavior suggests. The show has changed which Rick is which. It has changed which Morty is which. It has changed which Beth is which. It has, more than once, changed which Jerry is which. And it has, throughout, refused to surface those changes in a way that would force the audience to track them. The implication is that the family on screen has, in the strictest reading, never been any one family. It has been a procession of slightly different versions of a family, sharing a name, sharing memories that have been imported across realities, sharing affections that have transferred from one body to another without breaking. The paradox is what this means for the love we feel for these people. We have spent a long time with a Smith family. The family we love is not, strictly, a continuous Smith family. It is a family-shaped object that has occupied the show for many years. The reading the show invites, very gently, is that love is not actually about strict continuity. We have continued loving the family even as its parts have been quietly substituted. We did not notice some of the substitutions. We forgave some of the others. The show is making the same argument about long-term relationships in general. The person you love at 30 is not the same person you loved at 20. Their cells have turned over. Their memories have shifted. Their personalities have rearranged. The strict identity is gone. The continuity is, mostly, a story we tell about a series of slightly different people who happen to inhabit the same name. The Rick and Morty paradox, the largest one on this list, the one that holds all the others, is that the entire show is a meditation on this idea, performed in cartoon shapes, with infinite multiverses standing in for the simple, slow drift of ordinary identity over time. The version of Rick on screen now is not, in the strict sense, the same Rick we met in the first season. He has been through too much. He has been edited too many times. He has watched too many of his own deaths happen to other versions of himself. He has held the body of his original wife in the basement of his mind too many evenings. He has lost Rick Prime and gained the absence of Rick Prime, and learned to live with the absence. He is a different man now. The show has never told us he is a different man. It has just let him drift slowly into a different shape, in front of the camera, over years. The paradox is whether the difference is real. By the show's own rules, identity is not a hard fact. It is a position. The man in the position is the man in the position. He is Rick because the show says he is. He is the same Rick because the audience has decided he is. He is not the same Rick because he has been edited too many times for that to be strictly true. All three statements are correct. The show implies this is also true of every viewer. You are watching the show now as a version of yourself that has been altered by the time spent watching it. The you that started this episode is not the you who will finish it. The slow drift is happening to you while it is happening to Rick. The paradox is the show is, by this reading, a long, gentle illustration of how identity actually works for everyone, dressed in jokes about portals and pickles. The deepest reading is that there is no original Rick anymore. There is no original Morty anymore. There is no original Beth or Jerry or Summer. There are only the current versions, who have inherited the names. The show is not, by this reading, a story about a family. It is a story about a name. The name has had many occupants. The name continues to exist. The current occupants love each other in the way the current occupants do. The earlier occupants, the ones who were buried, the ones who were replaced, the ones who were merged into the version on screen now, are not coming back. The show declines to mourn them. Mostly, it just keeps going. The paradox at the top of the list is that this is also a description of an ordinary human life. The you who started this video is going to be a slightly different person by the end of it. The show has very quietly used 10 years of cartoon time travel and clones and decoys to demonstrate the obvious thing nobody quite wants to say out loud, which is that there is no continuous self. There is only the current occupant of the name. Rick has known this since the first season. The show has been trying to break it to you ever since. The paradox is that, having understood it, you will still love the family. They are still on screen. They are still telling jokes. The current occupants of those names are, for the duration of this episode, the people the show is asking you to care about. The implication is, you will care about them, because the camera is on them, because they look familiar, because love is largely a habit. The show, having dismantled the foundations of stable identity over years of careful storytelling, ends most of its episodes with the family eating dinner. The paradox is unresolved. The dinner is still happening. The people at the table are still the people at the table. The show is still the show. Before we close out the list and look at the show as a whole, there are paradoxes the show has built that did not quite fit cleanly into the ranking, but that matter to the larger picture. They are the smaller paradoxes folded into bigger episodes, the ones that would have been the centerpiece of a different series, and that Rick and Morty treats as background detail. They are worth sitting with for a moment before we get to the outro. There is the autoerotic assimilation paradox. In the second season episode of that name, Rick reunites with an old lover named Unity, who is a hive mind that takes over entire planets by consensual assimilation. The two of them spend the episode in a kind of distorted romantic interlude. Unity assimilates more and more of a planet's population, to please Rick. Rick rides high on the attention. By the end of the episode, Unity, having understood that she becomes worse when she is with him, leaves him a long, sad letter and ends the relationship. Rick returns home alone and, in the most upsetting scene the early show ever produced, attempts to end his own life in the garage and is interrupted only by Morty wandering in unannounced. The paradox is the structural one. Unity is a being who can be everyone in a population. She can occupy a planet's worth of consciousnesses at once. By any reading of the show's later identity logic, she is everyone she has assimilated. She is also one. When Rick is in bed with her, he is, in some sense, with a planet's worth of people. He is also with one person. The episode plays this for comedy, and then quietly turns the comedy into horror. Unity's letter is a clear-eyed assessment of what being with Rick does to her. She is a being who is, by nature, many people at once. He is a being who is, by behavior, several different men depending on which version of him is in the room. The paradox is that the two of them, who are each more than one person, cannot make a single relationship work. The implication is neither of them is really a single thing. They are temporary configurations. Their attempt to be in love is the attempt of two indeterminate beings to occupy the position called a couple. Unity has the wisdom to leave. Rick does not have the wisdom to be okay alone. The garage scene at the end is the show telling you, with extreme bluntness, that Rick is closer to nothing than he usually allows himself to admit. The Morty interruption is, in the most generous reading, what keeps him alive. The paradox is that the smartest man in the universe needs the dim grandson he has dragged through the multiverse to walk into the garage at the wrong moment in order to keep him from ending his life. The dependence is total. The show implies Rick has known this from the start, which is part of why he keeps Morty close. The reading is the Rick and Morty pairing is not, as the early show suggested, primarily about Morty's growth. It is about Rick's survival. He needs the boy in the room. Unity left him. Morty cannot leave him. Not yet. The paradox is Rick has built a relationship with his grandson that is, on a structural level, the substitute for the one Unity could not stay in. The boy is the lover Rick can keep. The wrongness of that reading is part of why the show only lets you glimpse it for a few seconds at a time, and then moves on. There is the old man and the seat paradox. In the fourth season episode of that name, Rick is revealed to own a small planet that he uses exclusively as a private toilet. The planet is undisturbed. It is calm. It has a single chair on it. Rick visits whenever he needs to be alone. The plot of the episode involves a man named Tony, who has invaded the planet and used the seat, and Rick's elaborate scheme of revenge against him. By the end of the episode, Tony, having achieved a kind of strange friendship with Rick across distance, dies in a separate accident, alone, with nobody to mourn him. Rick discovers this through a journal Tony left behind. He reads it on screen. He is, by his own ungenerous standards, briefly devastated. The paradox is the form of the loneliness. Rick is a man who has chosen, very deliberately, to need a private planet in order to feel safe enough to be alone with himself. He has had to build, with his own hands, a place outside the multiverse where his solitude cannot be intruded upon. The fact someone found it anyway is the show's joke. The fact he then formed a bond with the intruder is the show's heart. The paradox is Rick is, in the only space he has built explicitly for himself, the same lonely man he is everywhere else. The planet did not solve him. It only postponed him. The reading is exact. There is no place Rick can go to be alone with himself that will give him any version of himself worth being alone with. He brings the same man with him everywhere. The Tony death is the second half of the paradox. A man Rick had, for 2 short scenes, allowed himself to know, dies alone. Rick understands the death immediately as a description of himself. He could die alone too. He probably will. The episode does not flinch from this. It just lets Rick read the journal and lets him be, for a moment, sad. The show does not return to Tony often. The implication is Rick added him to the list of small dead things he carries in his head and walked on. The paradox is that Rick has built a private planet because he could not be alone in any other way, and that having a private planet did not make him less alone. The seat is still there. He still sits in it. Tony is still dead. The implication for the rest of the show is the loneliness is not a fixable feature of Rick. It is the texture of being him. There is the Night Family paradox. In the season 6 episode Night Family, Rick reveals the Smiths have, for some time, been using a sleep-based household management system in which their unconscious selves do chores and small tasks during the night, so that the conscious selves wake up to a tidier house and lighter to-do list. The Night Family begins to renegotiate the contract. They want recognition. They want time off. They want to be considered as people. The The conscious family resists. The episode escalates into something close to a domestic war, with the Night family fighting for autonomy and the Day family trying to preserve the arrangement that benefits them. The paradox is the question of who counts. The Night family is, by every detail the episode shows, conscious. They feel things. They want things. They argue back. They are, in the language of the show's other paradoxes, real. The Day family has been treating them as a feature of the house. The episode lets the Night family demand to be treated as people. It lets the Day family hesitate. It does not, in the end, give a clean answer. The paradox is the implication every human, by structure, contains versions of themselves who do not get the daylight share of decision-making. The Night family is a literal version of a thing the show implies. Across its run, is happening in every brain. There is the version of you that is on stage, and the versions of you that are doing work in the back. The back-of-house versions did not consent to the arrangement. Exactly, they were built into it. The episode is, in the most uncomfortable reading, asking whether the Day version of every viewer has been exploiting their own Night version. Whether the body that wakes up tired in the morning is tired because it has been working for someone else who happens to share its skin. The show is not explicit about this. It does not have to be. The Night family is sitting at the table. The Day family is sitting at the table. The dinner happens. The paradox is that the negotiation is unresolved and ongoing in every house in the multiverse, which is to say, in every house. The Night family episode is the show describing internal labor with the bluntness it usually reserves for external violence. There is the Prometheus paradox. The season 4 episode Prometheus opens with no warning or context on Rick and Morty having taken over a planet of bug people, with their faces grafted to bug bodies, in command of an empire whose origin we have not been shown. The episode then proceeds to retrace, in a non-linear fashion, how they ended up there. The paradox is the form of the opening. The show has trained the audience to expect coherent setups. Prometheus opens on a chaotic mid-mission state in which the protagonists are running an alien empire, and the rest of the episode is the work of catching up to a scene that was already in progress. The implication is, this happens to Rick and Morty often. Most of their lives, the show suggests, take place in the middle of stories we do not see beginnings for. The episodes we get are filtered. The episodes we do not get are presumably full of similar accidental empires and grafted faces and incidental conquests. The paradox is the show, by showing one such opening, is admitting the protagonists have lives off-screen that are at least as eventful as the ones on screen. The implication is the version of Rick and Morty we are tracking is a narrow ribbon of their actual lives. Whole stretches of equally weird, equally violent adventures are simply not being filmed. The reading is precise. The Smith family lives a version of their lives we can watch. They also live a version of their lives we cannot. The version we cannot watch is, by Prometheus implication, the larger version. The paradox is what this should do to our assessment of the characters. Rick is not, by this reading, a man who has had the adventures we have seen. He is a man who has had many more, of which we have seen a few. His personality is the result of a life that is mostly invisible to us. We cannot, by definition, know who he really is, because most of his life happens in the dark. The show implies this, very quietly, and then walks back into the next episode, with Rick and Morty pretending again that the show we are watching is the show we are watching. There is the Vindicators paradox. The third season episode, Vindicators 3, The Return of Worldender, places Rick into a superhero team where he is by far the most powerful and most unwilling member. The plot of the episode is, on its face, a parody of superhero team movies. The paradox is what Rick does inside it. He gets blackout drunk and, while unconscious, designs a series of brutal, lethal tests for the rest of the team, which the team encounters later in the episode. The implication is that the part of Rick which is willing to design ethical traps for other heroes is the part that operates without him, in the same way the Night family operates without the Day family. He is two people. The Rick who can articulate a moral position is a man with limits. The Rick who designs the tests is operating in the absence of those limits, in the blackout space. The episode plays this for comedy. The reading is darker. Rick has multiple operating modes, and not all of them require him to be present. The most cruel and most clever decisions can be made by parts of him he does not consciously control. The implication is, Rick is, on some level, dangerous to people who think they are dealing with the conscious version of him. The unconscious version is taking notes. The unconscious version, when activated, will do things the conscious version might not approve of. The paradox is the show implies, without insisting, that everyone in the family lives with this version of Rick. They know the man sitting at the table is not the only Rick in the building. They know another Rick is sleeping somewhere inside him, taking notes, ready to make decisions if the conscious one is unavailable. The reading is heavy. It explains why Morty is sometimes nervous around Rick, even when Rick is calm. It explains why Beth has a complicated relationship with the man she calls dad. They are not just dealing with the visible Rick, they are dealing with the unconscious Rick too, who could, at any time, become the active driver. The Vindicators episode is the show describing this in superhero costume. The paradox is, the costume is funny, and the implication is not. There is the Full Meta Jack Rick paradox. The Season 6 episode Full Meta Jack Rick returns the show to the meta-narrative territory of Never Ricking Morty, and pushes it further. The episode plays explicitly with the idea that characters are in a story, that the writers are working in real time, that the protagonist can be moved between formats, that nothing inside the show is structurally safe from being recast as something else. The paradox is the staying power of the meta layer. The show keeps returning to this idea. It has had multiple episodes about being a show. It has had multiple episodes about characters who realize they are characters. It has had multiple villains whose power is precisely that they understand the format better than the protagonists do. The implication is the show is, in a literal sense, the bottom of a stack the show itself cannot see past. There is a story train. There are writers. There are formats. There are villains who manipulate formats. The Smiths are at the bottom of all of this, eating dinner, trying not to think about who is choosing what they say. The paradox is Full Meta Jack Rick, like Never Ricking Morty, refuses to give the Smiths an exit. Every escape attempt becomes another piece of the format. The show is sealed. The reading is calm and exhausted. The show is telling you the show is a structure. The structure cannot be left. The protagonist can briefly notice the structure, can briefly try to disrupt it, and can be returned to the structure at the end of the episode in time for dinner. The implication is the entire run of the show is, on a long enough timeline, the same episode in different costumes. The dinner is always at the end. The format always wins. The paradox is unresolvable from the inside. It is also, by the show's own implication, true outside the show. In the lives of viewers who would also like to leave the format of their own lives and discover that the format does not have an exit. The Full Meta Jack Rick episode is the show stating this with as much honesty as it ever has, and then closing on the family at the table, eating dinner. Again, the format wins. The paradox sits there. There is the Starmort Rick turn of the Jerry paradox. The Season 4 finale Starmort Rick turn of the Jerry brings Rick into a confrontation with Tammy, the Federation agent who killed Bird Person, and with a version of Beth whose origin is hidden from us by the show's own deliberate refusal to clarify. The episode is, on its surface, a season finale of explosions and reversals. Underneath, it is the show staging a question about which Beth is in the room. Space Beth and home Beth confront each other. The show plays the confrontation for affection and tension. The paradox is the episode is, in the same hour, the show admitting it has been deliberately ambiguous about which Beth has been at the dinner table for several seasons, and the show refusing to resolve the ambiguity. The two Beths talk. They look at each other, they acknowledge each other, they go on with their lives. The reading is the show has decided, at this point, to treat Beth as a person who has split and reformed across realities, and that the question of which one is the original is no longer interesting to the show. The implication for the audience is the show has stopped tracking certain identity questions on purpose. They have been allowed to become indeterminate. Starmort Return of the Jerry is the moment the show formally announces this. The paradox is the audience side. We have been watching the show as if these questions could one day be resolved. The show has decided, on screen, that they will not be. The episode does not even pretend that resolution is coming. It just lets the Beths share the kitchen. The implication is the show has, since this episode, been written under a different rule. Identity is not the question. Behavior is the question. Who is at the table is whoever is at the table tonight. The paradox of Starmort Return of the Jerry is the show has stopped trying to answer the multiverse and has started trying to live in it. There is the Anatomy Park paradox. The first season episode Anatomy Park introduces the idea that Rick has built a theme park inside the body of a homeless man named Ruben, complete with attractions named after real human organs and constructed from the architecture of Ruben's biology. The park is intended for tourists who are shrunk down and inserted through medical access points. The park collapses in the episode because Ruben dies. The paradox is the size of the implication. A man's body has been a tourist destination for an undisclosed amount of time. People have been visiting his liver. People have been visiting his pancreas. The man on whose body the park is built is a homeless man who, in the brief moments the show gives him, seems to have no understanding of what has been done with his organs. The paradox is the consent. Rick built the park inside a person without explaining to the person what the park was. The person is dead by the end of the episode, and the park dies with him. The show plays this for satire of theme park business decisions. The implication is much heavier. Rick is a man who has, by his own routine, built attractions inside other people's bodies and used them for profit and amusement without checking whether the bodies wanted to be used that way. The reading scales up. If Anatomy Park existed inside Ruben, then somewhere, by the symmetry the show has been building, there is presumably a park inside someone else. There are presumably many such parks. There are presumably tourists, somewhere, walking around inside a body that has not been told it is being walked around inside. The implication for the show's larger world is the universe is full of beings whose bodies are being used as terrain by people who do not consider their consent relevant. The microverse paradox is a version of this at the level of universes. The Anatomy Park paradox is the same problem at the level of bodies. Rick treats anything that can be made small as something to be made small, and treats anything small as something to be used. The show, very calmly, allows that this is part of his routine. The fact we see only one such park in the run of the show does not mean there is only one. It means the show has only chosen to focus on one. The reading is, Ruben's body was, while he was alive, a vacation destination, and that his death is the only reason we ever met him. He is, in the structure of the show, an unconsenting host whose suffering ended when the writers needed him to end. The paradox is not the death. The paradox is the silence around the use. The show implies we should be uncomfortable about it, and then walks back into the next episode without resolving the discomfort. Anatomy Park is the show telling you, in the first season, there are levels of moral failure happening in the background of every adventure that we will simply not be shown. The park collapses. Rick walks away. There is presumably another park somewhere. The show does not return to it. The implication does. There is the Mr. Poopy Butthole paradox. Mr. Poopy Butthole survives the Total Rickle episode because Beth has complicated, painful feelings about him. The show lets him stay, even though, by every visible measure, he looks like exactly the kind of consistent, sweet character the parasites were supposed to be. The post-credits scenes of multiple later episodes return to him. He has aged. He has a job. He has a wife. He has, the show implies, an entirely real life happening in parallel with the Smith families, occasionally intersecting with theirs. The paradox is the proof of his reality. The Total Rickle rule said anything purely positive in memory was a lie. Mr. Poopy Butthole survived because Beth had complicated feelings. The complicated feelings were enough to anchor him in reality. The implication is the difference between a real friend and a parasite is not whether they have brought you joy. It is whether they have brought you any difficulty. Mr. Poopy Butthole is the proof of the rule. He stayed because he was not only sweet. He had been, in Beth's memory, also unsettling. He had been, in Beth's memory, also responsible for some pain. The show has, throughout, refused to clarify the exact nature of the pain. He once shot Beth in the leg. He has, at various points, been awkwardly involved in the family's affairs. He is, by his own admission, often broke. He is also, in the post-credits, frequently a loving father with a wife who clearly cares about him. The paradox is the question of which version of him is the real one. The show implies he is all of them. The implication for the audience is the recurring guest stars in the show have lives the show does not center, that they are people who happen to drift across the camera occasionally, and that their reality does not depend on whether we are watching. Mr. Poopy Butthole is the clearest case. He is alive. He is having dinner somewhere. The show occasionally checks in. The paradox is this is also presumably true of every other recurring character. They are alive when we are not watching. They are doing things off camera. The show is, by this reading, a long set of glimpses into lives that continue without us. Mr. Poopy Butthole is the show admitting it. The reading is gentle and almost comforting. The world the show built has people in it. The people have their own lives. The camera moves on. The lives continue. The paradox is the show, which has spent so much of its time portraying the universe as an indifferent and brutal place, has also, with this one character, portrayed it as a place where a man can have a small household and a small marriage and a small career and exist in the background of a friend's larger story without resentment. He is the calmest paradox on the list. He just keeps coming back with a little more gray in his hair and reminding the audience that not all of this universe is despair. Some of it is just somebody else's quiet life, glimpsed for a moment and then left alone again. There is the Rickshank Rickdemption paradox. The third season premiere, The Rickshank Rickdemption, tells, in the back half of the episode, a story about Rick's origin. He shows a Galactic Federation agent a memory of his original wife and daughter, of an alternate Rick visiting from another reality and offering to share portal technology, of him refusing, of the alternate Rick bombing his house and killing his wife and daughter in retaliation. The The memory ends with him swearing revenge. The agent is moved. The audience is moved. And then, in the final moments of the sequence, Rick reveals the memory was a fabrication. He had been spoofing the memory the entire time as a tactical move to escape custody. The agent is killed. Rick escapes. The Galactic Federation collapses. The paradox is what to do with the memory. The show has told us, on screen, the memory was a fake. It has also, in later seasons, returned to the same memory with subtle variations and treated it as if it were true. The killing of Diane and the original Beth has become a confirmed event in the show's continuity by the time Rick Prime is killed in Unmortrican. The paradox is the memory we were told was fabricated has become canon. The show has not explained how. The implication is the memory was a fabrication and also a truth. The Rick Shank Redemption episode is the show explicitly admitting it will fabricate a backstory for tactical reasons, and then, later, quietly canonizing the backstory anyway. The reading is the show treats canon as a moving target. A scene that was, in one episode, a lie, can be later treated as a fact, with no scene that confirms the switch. The show does not stage the moment where the lie became real. It just lets the audience drift toward treating the lie as real, because no other backstory has been offered. The paradox is the show is using a kind of casual narrative drift to install its own emotional foundation. The Rick we know is a man whose family was killed by another Rick. The first time we were told this, we were told we were being lied to. We have been allowed to believe it anyway. The implication is this is also true of the way personal histories work for most people. The stories we tell about our own backgrounds, the ones that explain who we became and why, are often partly tactical at first and partly truth later. We tell them because they explain us. They explain us partly because we tell them. The show is doing this on screen, very slowly, over multiple seasons. The Rick Shank Redemption was the original lie. Unmortrican treats it as the foundational fact. The paradox is the drift. The reading is that Rick himself, who would know, has been letting the lie become a fact, because the fact is more useful to him than no fact would be. He has told the story so many times that the story has taken on the weight of having happened. The paradox is what the show implies about the rest of us. We are, the implication goes, all doing a version of this. The backstories we recite are partly tactical, partly true, and we lose track of where the lines were. The Rick Shank Redemption is the show staging this in a season premiere, and then taking the rest of the run of the show to deepen the implication. There is one more paradox before we close. It is small. It is the paradox of the show itself continuing. Rick and Morty has been on the air long enough now that the production behind it has changed. A controversy involving the original co-creator Justin Roiland resulted in his departure from the show, and the lead voices were recast in Season 7 with new performers stepping in. The show continued. The new voices held the characters. The audience absorbed the shift, in some cases quickly, in some cases with reluctance. The paradox is the way the show, which has spent 10 years arguing that identity is a position rather than a continuous thing, was suddenly required to demonstrate this argument outside the fiction. The Rick on screen now is voiced by a different actor than the Rick on screen in the early seasons. By the show's own logic, this is not a contradiction. The character is the position. The voice in the position is, week to week, whoever the position is being held by. The Rick we are watching now is, by the show's own internal philosophy, no less real than the Rick we used to watch. He has different fingerprints behind the microphone. He is the same character. The paradox is the show, which had been preparing the argument for a decade, suddenly had to make the argument out loud. The reading is striking. The show that had been describing the slow drift of identity over time was suddenly subject to a much faster drift of its own. It survived. It is still telling stories. The characters are still recognizable. The audience, slowly, has been adjusting. The paradox is, the show is now a living illustration of its own thesis. There is no continuous Rick. There is only the current occupant of the name. The current occupant is doing the work. The show goes on. The reading is gentle. The longer you sit with it, the more it begins to feel like the show was, perhaps without intending to, preparing itself and its audience for this exact transition. The Cronenberg paradox prepared you for it. The Beth clone paradox prepared you for it. The Solarix paradox prepared you for it. The central finite curve paradox prepared you for it. By the time the voice changed, the audience had been trained in the philosophy. The character was the position. The voice was a vessel. The vessel changed. The character held. The paradox is the show survived its own production crisis because it had built, in its fiction, a way to think about exactly that crisis. The show, by being the show it is, gave the audience the tools to keep watching it. That is the quietest paradox on the list, and one of the most affecting. The show described its own future, and then walked into it. We come to the close. We have been at this for a long time. and you have been with us. And I hope, somewhere along the way, the voice has started to soften and the room has started to feel quieter. Rick and Morty is, when you sit with it for hours at a time, a stranger and gentler show than it first appears. The opening years marketed themselves on shock and brutality and cleverness. And those are real qualities of the show. But underneath them is a piece of careful philosophy about what it is to be a person in a universe that has too many of you. The paradoxes ranked in this video are not the show's failings. They are the structure the show was built on. Every joke about a pickle, every cutaway to an alien cable channel, every brief moment of a Jerry sitting in a daycare has been the show describing very gently the same handful of basic ideas. Identity is a position. Continuity is a story we tell about a series of positions. The family at the table is whoever happens to be at the table. The love between them is the love between the current occupants. The grief over the previous occupants is real and is part of the love. The universe is large enough that none of it can be expected to be unique, and small enough that the dinner table still matters. The show has been saying this in costume for 10 years. It will, presumably, keep saying it. The paradox at the top of the list is the one the show keeps returning to. There is no original Rick. There is no original Morty. There is no original Beth or Jerry or Summer or Mr. Poopy Butthole. There are the current occupants. They are the show. They are the people we have come to love. The version of the show we will be watching 10 years from now will be a different show in many of its details, populated by characters who will have drifted further from their original selves than we currently imagine. And we will, presumably, still be watching, because the camera will be on them. And that, by the show's own logic, is what makes them real. Rick and Morty's place in culture is, partly, it is one of the very small number of shows that built its philosophy into its structure, and let the structure carry the philosophy across years of difficult production, public controversies, and shifting audience expectations. It is a show that has, more than once, asked you to grieve a character, and a show that has, more than once, brought characters back without being able to confirm that the version brought back is the version that was lost. It is a show that has trusted its audience to be okay with that. Most audiences have been. The trust was, on a long timeline, well placed. There is one more thing to say before we close, and it is the thing the outro is for. The reason this kind of long sleep narration suits the show is the show, by its own structure, is constantly inviting you to drift. The drift between identities, the drift between realities, the drift between which Beth is in the kitchen tonight, is the same kind of drift you might be doing right now as the voice settles around you and the light gets lower. The show is a long, careful illustration of how identity drifts in the dark. You are also a person whose identity is drifting in the dark. Tonight, in the quiet, with this video on, you are the current occupant of your own name. Tonight, the you who will wake up tomorrow will be a slightly different occupant of the same name. The show would say both of you are real. The show would say the love you have for the people in your own life is the love of the current occupants of those names, and that this is not a thinner kind of love. It is the kind of love the show argues is the only real kind. The paradox at the top of the list, the one all the others lead to, is the one the show keeps quietly inviting you to live with. There is no original you. There is no continuous you. There is only the you that is here tonight, and the people you love, who are the current occupants of the names. The show suggests, with as much warmth as it ever offers, that this is enough. It has been enough for the Smith family for many seasons. It has been enough for the show itself to survive. It is, presumably, enough for you. If you have made it this far, thank you for being here. I hope the room is a little softer than it was when we started, and I hope, when you wake up, the day is gentle to you. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.